mengucap Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Pada pagi hari ini secara resmi saya buka BNI Investor Daily Summit 2024.
Melalui BNI Investor Daily Summit 2024, kami ingin menyampaikan pesan optimisme, sekaligus menjadikan event ini sebagai ajang bertukar pikiran serta mensosialisasikan visi serta arah kebijakan ke depan agar Indonesia dapat menghindari middle income trap.
Di Asia nanti akan ada 3 kekuatan ekonomi baru: India, China, dan Indonesia.
Indonesia juga menjadi negara yang disegani dengan keberhasilan kepemimpinan Indonesia di kancah internasional.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Jangan takut. Bangsa Indonesia bangsa yang berani. Bangsa Indonesia bangsa yang optimis. Kita insya Allah akan jadi negara maju. Kita akan jadi negara makmur, saudara-saudara kalian.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted today to welcome one of Indonesia's pride. She is one of the well-respected world-leading economists. Please welcome joining us today, Profesor Mari Elka Pangestu. Our second speaker, Indonesia, like many other developing countries, we want to learn the success of the Chinese economy, and he is the one behind the Chinese economic transformations. Please welcome joining us today, Professor Justin Yifu Lin. Thank you so much, Ibu Mari, Professor Lin, for joining us today. As we know, we are currently entering a new global economic order, and we would very much like to hear insights from Ibu Mari, who's gonna discuss about how Indonesia in the new global economic order. Please, Ibu.
Thank you, Lily. Welcome to Justin, my old friend. And thank you, all of you, for staying. It has been a long introductory session, but I hope today we will discuss more about the world and how the global situation is important for Indonesia to understand. I'm going to raise 4 points. One is I'm going to talk about the global economic outlook and all the uncertainties and challenges, risks and challenges that were mentioned already. And I think I just wanted to take one point that was mentioned by Gus Miftah as well as repeated by Sri Mulyani, that if you're optimistic, then you will look at the opportunities within the challenges. But if you're pessimistic, then you will look at the risks as something very scary and something that's going to be a downside risk to the global economic outlook as well as to Indonesia's outlook. So I'm going to try to give you a balanced picture of both the challenges as well as the opportunities. And I'm going to talk about 3 challenges. One is the defragmentation and decoupling within the US-China trade tensions. Second is the increased uncertainties. And third, the decline in the global economic order or multilateralism. So those are my 4 points. So first of all, on the global economic outlook, I think we have seen the recovery after the pandemic and the global energy shock that happened because of the war and so on. But it's a stable, things are stabilized, But what is the outcome is slower world economic growth and slower growth in all countries in the world. If you like numbers, the trajectory for growth is about 0.5% lower than pre-pandemic globally. And for East Asia, it's probably between 0.5 to 1%. So take Indonesia, for example. We've been able to stabilize, and we are probably experiencing higher growth than many other countries in the region. But we're growing at 5%, and we're going to be growing presumably in the next 2 or 3 years at 5%, compared to 6% from 2004 to 2014, and around 7% pre-Asian financial crisis. China, Justin is going to talk to you more about China, but China slowdown is also something that has affected the overall emerging countries' average economic growth, as well as obviously China's slowdown has probably more of an impact on countries like Indonesia and others which have a bigger reliance on China trade and investment compared to the global economy. I don't think I need the slides. Is it? Oh, it's coming up there, not up here. Okay, it's okay. So we are going back to normal, recovering, but it's a slower growth. And slower growth means slower increase in per capita income. And some economies have actually not gone back to pre-pandemic levels. And that has an impact on purchasing power, consumer purchasing power, and so on and so forth. For Indonesia, I think we saw all the figures from Sri Mulyani just then. We have recovered, we're stable at 5%, and Indonesia performed very well actually throughout all this uncertainty and shocks. Our credit rating was unchanged all throughout this period compared to many other countries which had downgrades. So why is that the case? What part of the reason is fiscal discipline. We had to increase our budget deficit to 6%, as Sri Mulyani mentioned, when we had to do the COVID response. But we were able to bring it back down in 3 years. So that is one of the big points about Indonesia. The reason I mention this is because fiscal discipline moving forward will still be important and can affect your credit rating and can affect your borrowing costs, etc., etc., because we are in a room full of investors here. And the second part of the story about the global economic outlook, which is important, is what Sri Mulyani already emphasized just then. She said about the Fed reducing its interest rate. She said that it's going to be higher for longer than what we thought. And this is really the case. I think if you look at all the projections, there is going to be a reduction in the Fed interest rate because there was one big reduction already, but signs are saying that they're going to be very slow in reducing the rest in the foreseeable future. So progress is going to be very slow, which means we will still be in a high interest rate environment, at least for the next two years. It's going to take that long. Don't forget that during the global financial crisis, interest rates went to almost zero. And then during the inflationary period, because of the energy crisis and food crisis, there was the highest increase in interest rates ever to around 5 or 6% in US Fed rate. So to come down, right now it's about 4 to 5%. It's going to take time to come down to the 2 to 3% that it normally is at. So this is the situation. So for investors, this is going to be the case. But how about exchange rate and the external environment? I think we will see capital flows have come back to Indonesia. It's stabilized because of the interest rate changes. But the key will still be domestic policy and the fiscal discipline and how investors will see whether their capital should be in Indonesia or not. So I'll say a little bit more about that later, but that's really the main messages. And just want to say that the other two big issues are higher uncertainty with the Middle East conflict, with climate and other issues, and then the geopolitics. The US-China tensions are going to continue no matter who wins the US elections. I think everybody's accepted that, and we just don't know how that's going to play out. But there's opportunities. The opportunities in the defragmentation that's happening is leading to diversification and relocation, and this is opportunity. And the US economy may be stronger than before, and let's look at new sources of growth. I sit on a number of company boards, and also in the case of countries, it's kind of the same conversation. There are three things that we always talk about: how to be agile, because there's so many uncertainty, and how to change the mindset of the people in your organization or in your country for that matter. Second, green, and third, technology. Especially AI. Everybody's kind of like thinking, how do I respond to AI? And I just wanted to put a plug for one of my favorite subjects. Lily will notice, many of you in the room will notice. We talk a lot about hilirisasi or downstreaming. We talk a lot about manufacturing, EVs and batteries, but we hardly ever talk about services. Even in Sri Mulyani's slide just then, we were just talking about this. No services, where services should also be the new source of growth. Not just tourism. Tourism is important, but the new modern services like based on digital. So I'm not sure how many, is that clock right? Yes. So it means, okay, it's going up, right? Okay, sorry, just making sure I don't take Justin's time. And we also, the intention of this session is to have more interaction with you. I'm sure you're going to hopefully have a lot more questions than what we can present. The second topic that I wanted to raise was this defragmentation risks versus diversification opportunities. So if you talk about defragmentation, it is about the US-China trade war since 2018, and how the tariffs have increased on a number of products, such as semiconductors, green technologies, electronics, and automotive. And also, we have the numbers, right? Because it's already been 5 years. And then what do the numbers show? The numbers actually show, as you would expect, China's imports from the US went down, and US imports from China went down. But third countries' exports to the US and to the rest of the world went up. And China's imports from non-US also went up. What is happening here? At the same time, the US-China trade on the products that have high tariffs. So the big discussion, lots of papers being written and analysis on this. Have we decoupled? Has US-China decoupled? The answer is no. US-China only decoupled mainly in the sectors where the tariffs are high, as you would expect. But on everything else, actually, some of the trade increased, right? The other number that is going around is, if you actually had full decoupling, if you had US-China totally decoupled, which would be a very, very bad world, the cost is estimated by IMF as 7% of world GDP. That would be the cost of total decoupling. But at the moment, the decoupling is, let's say, limited to the so-called sensitive sectors, or in the language of Jake Sullivan, the small garden with a high wall, yeah? But of course, we are worried that the small garden is going to get bigger and bigger, right? So let's talk about the opportunity side, which is the third countries that have been able to increase its trade with the US and with China. The main beneficiaries are Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam and Mexico. These are kind of the four big beneficiaries. Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines also benefited to a lesser extent, as well as India, and some of the Eastern European countries. So that's the picture that's emerging. But let us not forget that the US and the Europeans are also continuing to watch this. What is happening is that these countries become the new source of imports to the US as well as to Europe. But we see a lengthening of the supply chain with China, because a lot of the imports and the inputs are coming still from China. Take Apple moving to India. Yes, it moved to India, but most of the components are still coming from China, for instance. So it's only a matter of time before increased restrictions will come. So even though there's opportunity, there's also increased risks of the so-called resilient supply chain being questioned by the importers. So this is something that means we need to be developing, and this is my big theme. What you see already emerging is regional value chains and regional supply chains. And you may end up, especially if you take EV, the progress of the restrictions of EV from Europe and the US, you're basically talking about two supply chains. Supply chains to supply all the rest of the world outside of US mainly, and to fulfill the requirements of security concerns by the US. The most recent ban on the software and the hardware of EV vehicles in China. Basically, who's being hurt? I think it's the American consumers who won't be able to access the low-cost and very efficient EVs that are available. So my final point on this defragmentation is that there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to play a role, take advantage of these sources of growth within the reconfiguration of the regional supply chain and value chain. But you have to have the right investment climate. You have to have the ecosystem that supports the development of these supply chains. And you also have to have the people. Yeah? It's not just so easy to go from one sector to another sector. You do need a green skills or a technology skills agenda. And that this whole story is not just trade. It's trade, investment, and technology flows. So I read Financial Times, I think it was yesterday or today, it had a very interesting number about Chinese outward investment going up by 12% in the 8 months of 2024 to 112 billion. A lot of it is in green technologies and EVs. It talks about how there will be different hubs in Eastern Europe, in Asia and South Asia for these development of these technologies, which they are already very advanced in. And it talks about, this is not just about relocating manufacturing, but it's also bringing in technology, bringing in the engineering capacity, as well as building out the ecosystem. So this is something that, you know, for Indonesia, how do we make sure that we get the advantage of that? Okay, third point. Let's talk about the greater uncertainties and challenges that face us globally, and that what does that mean for Indonesia? I've got actually 5 here. I'll mention them very briefly. One is continued conflict and wars, including in the Middle East. There could be issues in the Taiwan issue, the Korean Peninsula, South China Seas. These are all the risks that we always talk about. There's climate. There's other shocks, such as in health, there's technology, and there's increased social tensions. Let me just say a few things about each of these 5. On war and conflict, the most recent conflict, obviously, is the Israel invasion. And the fact that the oil price did go up to almost $80 just in the last few weeks. What does that mean? It will mean like 2022. And for Indonesia, because we do still have a fuel subsidy, it will have an impact on us fiscally. So this is there will be continued uncertainty around oil prices moving forward. And the oil price shock, the oil price increase is also not unrelated to climate, because of the fear of hurricane. I forget the name of the hurricane. Let me see whether I wrote it down in my notes. There's a hurricane coming to Florida, which is going to affect the Gulf oil production, and therefore also led to the price increase. So second, on climate. I just want to mention 3 things. One is climate-related shocks can have an impact on food, on energy, and so on. Second is the increase in countries using climate-related policies that will affect trade and investment. Yeah? In other words, like CBAM, or the fact that now you have to have proof, if you're from companies, I'm sure you're facing this. Banks are facing the fact that you have to meet a climate risk assessment. You have to have X%, hopefully in green financing. So ESG as well as climate-related requirements are already there, but they are going to increase. So the key word is, if you want to be competitive today, you also have to be part of a sustainable supply chain. Yeah? And that goes all the way back to having renewable energy as the source of your energy, right? We know that we have lost investments in the recent past because we couldn't supply the renewable energy that they needed, for instance. Yeah? So that's one aspect of climate that will be important for investors. Other shocks could be related to health. And this is going to just increase because of urbanization and climate change. Technology, everything digital and AI. I think every single conversation I've been having in many forums as well as in the boards that I sit on, it's about AI. What are we going to do about this? How do we change our systems? How do we face the risks, the cyber risks and the risks of using AI? AI has opportunities, but it also has risks that people are still trying to figure out, trying to understand. So this is going to be a big issue to be dealt with. Finally, social tensions. I think we have seen the world move in I would say an uncomfortable space. That's my own feeling, that you have democracy being affected, you have polarization, and a lot of the basis is inequality as well as the pressures that middle class are facing. This is everywhere, not just Indonesia, including in the US. And if you take the case of Indonesian middle class, as you know, this has been a big topic of discussion since Khatib Basri wrote his column in Kompas. I think there's been lots and lots of good discussion, I suppose, on the middle class. So we saw the numbers that our middle class went down from 57.3 million to 47.8 million between 2019 to 2023. That's 17% of the population. What is the middle class? The middle class is people who earn 1.9 to 9.3 million rupiahs per month. And this is the sector that is being squeezed because we take care of the poorest or the bottom 40% with all the social programs, but we don't really take care of the middle class. And this has been, is it housing, is it education, is it amenities? But at the end of the day, it's about jobs and wages, right? We saw an increase in the absorption of the informal sector. So we have low open unemployment rate, but it's because they are being absorbed in the informal sector, which has a lower wage and, of course, a lack of decent work and so on and so forth. So this is going to be one of the big issues for Indonesia. So let me close finally on probably Lily and me and all the people sitting in front, their favorite topic about the global order, economic order, and the decline in multilateralism that we see happening with unilateralism by the US in, say, since 2016, and the rise of use of industrial policy, like what Ibu Sri Mulyani mentioned. These are all dimensions that are affecting trade and investment, and the fact that we are facing unilateral measures, and we no longer can go to the WTO and raise our flag and say, this is unfair, and get some remedy. We can still use remedies like anti-dumping, but trade dispute seems to be no longer an avenue. And we also are seeing security issues being used for restrictions of trade and investment. Security is allowed under the WTO rules as an exception, but at the moment there's no guardrails, no parameters as to what you mean by security. This is a very big issue that we face, and it is going to affect our trade and investment. And how do you define resilient supply chain? There's a security element, there's a climate environment element, and maybe there's going to be more elements. We just heard about something that the EU passed about disciplines on measures that doesn't include just environment, but includes things like human rights. The upshot is, let me just conclude with what does that mean for Indonesia? Indonesia and third countries have to navigate between US and China. And what we need to do is not be drawn to the US or China. We need to be able to continue to engage with both of them because they're both important trade investment partners and other partners for us. But how do we as third countries, as middle powers, by ourselves or together with ASEAN or regional or East Asia, how do we make sure that we also have a voice, and we need to have a voice, and influence the processes in the multilateral processes, whether it's the WTO or the multilateral development banks and so on, and also strengthen our own regional economic integration and processes. And the one, I'm not saying this because many of us have been involved with RCEP, but RCEP is already there. It's the largest trade agreement. It can be invigorated because you already see regional supply chains happening, right? So how can we use what already exists in our structures, and by the way, does have China in there, to strengthen the regional supply chains and make it a resilient supply chain for our own region and our own growth, but have it in an open way. Open regionalism means you do it for your own region, but you're exporting it out as well to third countries and externally. With the footnote, a very big footnote, what do you do with the US? This is why you may end up with two supply chains, at least for some certain products. But that's how we need to navigate this, and I hope that the new government of Indonesia will take a leadership role in the regional outreach, in the potential for strengthening regional economic cooperation and integration, and play a leadership role so that, I think, it was President Jokowi said, we should be able to determine how we want to shape our country and the policies, but we do need the policies domestically as well as internationally to support that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibu Mari. Before we discuss any further on the role of Indonesia in the global economy, we're going to invite the second speaker. Back to 1994, Professor Lin wrote a book on economic transformations that will be the basis for China's economy today. And we're going to learn how China's economic transformations and what are insights that you can share for Indonesia. Please, Professor Lin.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to speak in this summit, and especially with my good friend, Ibu Mari Pangestu. We are talking about Indonesia in a new global economic order. I think if we do not discuss China, the picture will not be complete. Because China currently is the second largest economy in the world, measured by market exchange rate. And if we measure the economic size by purchasing power parity, China is the largest economy in the world. And China is also the largest trading country in the world. And since in 2008, China contributed about 30% to the global growth every year. And equally important, China is the largest trading partner of Indonesia and the second largest source of foreign direct investment in Indonesia. And if China can grow well, it will be a good news for the world. But if China performs poorly, it can be a headache for everybody in the world. And I'm sure recently you read a lot in the newspaper about the news about China, about China has reached the peak, or even China may collapse. However, this kind of prediction has been there every several years. But China, so far, is the only major country in the world which did not have a crisis, which maintains stability and growth. And I'd like to say, as Didi mentioned, I might be the first person to predict that China will maintain stability and a continual growth. Because in 1994, exactly 30 years ago, at that time, China is still one of the poorest countries in the world. And I predict in my book, China would overtake US to be the largest economy in the world, measured by purchasing power parity by the time of 2015. No one believed in me. But actually, China overtook US in 2014, a year ahead of my prediction. And in the past 30 years, I was often invited to speak in a forum like this. And then my message, certainly, was always very positive about China. And I have been accused of being too optimistic about China. But look retrospectively, I have been always right. And so today, instead of talking about what is happening in China this year, last year, I'm going to share with you how come I can always be right. And I want to transform you to be an expert of China in 10 minutes. The reason why I have been always right, I look into 3 factors. The first one is the aspiration of the Chinese people and also the government. The second one is looking into the potential of growth in a country. And the third one is to look into the challenges and the way to cope with the challenges in China. Most people were pessimistic about China because they always look at the problem of China. But as a developing country, like in Indonesia, we always have a lot of problems. But if we want to know our future, I think it's first better to look into what is the aspiration of the people. For example, in Indonesia, you have Golden Indonesia 2045. You want to be in a developed country by 2045. China has something similar. We have 2 goals. One is to double our GDP on the basis of 2020. By the time of 2010, by the time of 2035. That is the first goal. The second goal is to become an advanced, modern country by the time of 2049, when China celebrates the centennials of the founding of the People's Republic. And a so-called an advanced, modern country. The idea is to reach the same level like Germany, like France, like UK, like Japan today compared to the US. That means by the time China's per capita GDP would have to be 50% or more of the US. 50% of per capita GDP of the US by that time. In 2019, the per capita GDP in China was 22.6% of the US. And if China wants to achieve that aspiration by 2049, China would have to grow 2.7% higher than the growth rate of the US. And the US growth rate in the past half a decade was about 1.8%. So that means that if China wants to achieve the aspiration of becomes an advanced modern country, similar to Germany, France, UK, and so on, China would have to maintain 4.5% growth. In the 30-year period between 2019 and 2049. That is the first one, aspiration. And the second one is to look into the potential. Whether China has the potential to achieve the growth rate. And I say, yes. First, China is still a catching up country. There's so-called the latecomers advantages. And that is still huge. Because I mentioned in 2019, the per capita GDP in China, measured by purchasing power parity, was 22.6% of the US. It was similar to Germany in 1946. At that time, Germany per capita GDP was between 20 to 23% of the US. Similar to Japan in 1956, and also similar to South Korea in 1985. Okay. For these three countries, Germany grew at a rate of 9.4% per year, continuously for 16 years, from 1946 to 1962. And for Japan, it grew at a 9.6% per year, continuously for 16 years, from 1956 to 1972. And for Korea, it grew at a 9% per year, continuously, from 1985 to 2001. In spite of Korea was hit by Asian financial crisis like Indonesia, with negative growth for about 2 years. And if these three countries can grow beyond 8% and 9%, we can also look into the growth rate of per capita GDP for these three countries. Because during the period of time, Germany population growth rate was 0.8%. So per capita GDP growth rate for Germany in those 16 years was 8.6%. And for Japan, its population growth rate was 1%. So that means per capita GDP growth rate, again, was 8.6% per year. And then for Korea, its population growth rate was 0.9%. Its per capita GDP growth rate was 8.1%. So from these figures, I'm confident China has a potential to maintain the per capita GDP growth rate of 8% between the year of 2019 to 2035, 16-year period. And compared to Germany, Japan, and Korea, China today has other advantages they do not have at that time. That is the fourth industrial revolution, which like big data, digital economy, artificial intelligence. For this technology in the fourth industrial revolution, China stands in the same starting line with any other country. And compared to other countries, China has three advantages. The first one, talent pool. China has 1.4 billion population. China has a lot of genius. China has a lot of engineers, scientists, and so on. Human capital advantage. Secondly, China has the largest unified domestic market. Because China GDP is already the largest measured by purchasing power parity. The third one, China has the most complete manufacturing ecosystem. The supply chain in China is the best in the world. So for the fourth industrial revolution technology and so on, in the software part, you already see that. The most popular downloaded apps in the US, like TikTok, Shein, and Temu and so on, are owned by the Chinese companies. And if the new technology requires hardwares, the best example is Tesla. Tesla developed in the US for more than 10 years. And the largest number of output, Tesla in the US, was less than 30,000 units a year. And as a result, because the output was too small, Tesla was almost bankrupt. So Tesla came to China in 2019, made an investment. The next year, Tesla produced 480,000 cars. And made Tesla a company going to bankrupt to become now the highest value automakers in the world. The market cap was 600 billion US dollars. So with this, I'm confident. Before 2035, China still has a potential to grow at 8%. Certainly China, like other countries, has a lot of problems and challenges. Time limit. I only talk about one of the most important challenges. That is so-called great power rivalry between China and the US. Certainly, US is still the most powerful country in terms of military, technology, finance, and also ideology. And US policy toward China today was similar to US policy toward Japan in the 1980s and earlier to Germany and so on. And the US want to use its technology, military power to stop the growth of China. And as you know, US engaged the trade war, the technological war against China, try to contain China's growth. In the past, US seemed to be always been successful, right? In the 1980s, the GDP size of Japan was about 65% of Japan measured by market exchange rate. Today, it's only 16% of the US. If you look in the past, you will think, well, China will stop growth, as many people discuss in the newspapers. But I'm confident China will maintain growth. To give you one simple example, in the past, in some companies, their technology all compete US companies. You will start adopt some policy to acquire the companies or force the companies to stop growth. One good example is Alstom, the energy companies owned by France. In the 2000 and the time, it was the best company in the world. And the U.S. arrested its CEO in 2013 and charged a fine of $700 million and forced this company to share to GM. And a similar story happened to Huawei, right? In 2019, U.S. started to put Huawei on the entity list and prohibit U.S. companies to share any components to Huawei. At that time, Huawei mobile phone overtook Apple to be the largest producers of mobile phones. Well, if you look in the past, Huawei was bankrupt, or Huawei was sold to the U.S. by now, but actually not. After 3 years, 2022, Huawei started to release Mate 50. 2023, Huawei released Mate 60. Last month, Huawei released Mate XT, the 3-holder mobile phone. I just got one, I can show you. It's the best. It's the best mobile phone, most sophisticated, most beautiful mobile phone. The best mobile phone that you can have in the world. If U.S. cannot win over a company by using all its national power, I don't think that U.S. will be able to stop the growth of China. Certainly, it's a challenge China needs to cope with. I say China has 8% growth potential. And because of the great power rivalry, it may reduce 0.5 percentage point. Certainly, China also needs to cope with other challenges. For example, the climate change. China pledged to cap the urban emission by 2030 and to have carbon neutral by 2060. China needs to pay for that. China also needs to deal with domestic issues, regional income disparity, and so on. But I'm confident. With 8% growth potential, China will be able to maintain 5 to 6% of the growth up to 2035. And from 2035 to 2050, based on my analysis, China will have 6% growth potential. Certainly, China also needs to cope with all kinds of challenges. But I'm sure China will be able to maintain 3 to 4% growth. And with this growth performance, China will be able to maintain 4.5% growth between 2019 and 2049. And China will become an advanced, modern country. And with this growth performance, I'm confident China will continue to contribute 30% of growth to the world. And with this growth, I'm sure China will be a best companion of Indonesia to realize the goal of Golden Indonesia 2045. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lin, for sharing your insight on the economic transformations of China. For the last 30 minutes, we're gonna give you a chance to raise questions, so please be prepared with your questions. Before that, let me ask Ibu Mari Pangestu. She is one of the key figures other than Pak Enggar Tiasto in terms of formulating the RCEP. So Ibu, would you please share to other investors here and academics and other civil societies on how businesses can optimally use the RCEP?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm not sure this has been a big issue, right? Awareness of the business people actually of this opportunity of the East Asia Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the 10 ASEAN countries with Japan, Korea, China, Australia, and New Zealand. India was supposed to be there, but India is not there yet. We say yet. We still have hope that India will join, because if India joins, then it would really be like half of the world population is actually in this comprehensive economic partnership. A lot of the business people, they know about ASEAN China, they know about ASEAN Japan, but they may not necessarily see what is the benefit of having ASEAN Japan, ASEAN China, ASEAN Korea compared to the RCEP. The advantage is that instead of doing the value chain as ASEAN and China, ASEAN and Japan, ASEAN and Korea, which is like this, you can also now benefit from Korea, Japan, and China, and building on a regional value chain that has that component in there. Yeah? And this is something which is the biggest advantage, I would say, for businesses and for investors, especially those who are looking for reconfiguring their supply chain. And it should mean a more diversified supply chain, which hopefully can be more will be more beneficial for each of the countries, as well as building a regional value chain which is more resilient in many definitions. Resilient in terms of being more agile to shocks, so that you can move between different sources, and also resilient in terms of servicing the US or China market. Now, the biggest problem is implementation of this agreement, as you well know. A lot of it has to do with technicalities, which will need leadership. It has something to do with a very boring thing called rules of origin, to be able to make it cumulative, as the way I tried to describe it. We don't have to go into the details. Those of you who do exporting and know that you have to fill all these forms will know what that means. But we need to make sure that we can implement it in the way, in the spirit that it was designed. And that needs political leadership to make sure that the negotiators and the implementers at the technical level will come through. And this is what I really hope that the leadership of ASEAN with Indonesia there can actually implement RCEP in the spirit that it was meant to be. And by the way, RCEP is Indonesia ASEAN-led, not China-led. Because the moment you say China-led, we get into a lot of trouble with you know what. So we just want to re-emphasize that message.
We acknowledge that.
Yes.
Thank you, Ibu. We're going to discuss further on ASEAN and RCEP tomorrow in the morning sessions with Dr. Iman Pambagio and Dr. Rebecca. Now I'm going to go to Professor Lin. As you probably heard from Presidents Joko Widodo and a couple of ministers repeated in private or in public, one of the ways for Indonesia to achieve Indonesia Golden 2045 is by Hillarizations. And what worries many of economists or businesses downstreaming, it comes with the implementations of local content requirements. It comes with probably not so efficient allocations, and the government might not be the right actor or might not have enough, say, comprehensive analysis to choose which industries, or in short, we're not agree with picking winners policy at the cost of other industries. How can we learn from China on these issues?
Well, may not learn from China. Should learn from my book, The New Structural Economics, because my book generated its theory from the successful experiences, not only in China, but also in other East Asian economies, and as well as in other parts of the world. If you want to be successful, certainly you need to raise your productivity all the time in order to increase your income. You know, most of the mainstream theory talk about resource allocation, how to make efficiency of the resource allocation. But if you look into the successful country, the most important thing is how to promote the productivity growth all the time. And if you want to, increase your productivities, you need to follow one principle. In the way of the growth, you need to follow your competitive advantages, determined by your factor endowments. That's what you have now. And to look into what you can do well based on what you have. That is your competitive advantages. It's a very general principle. If you allow me another 2 or 3 minutes, I can make it even more applicable. For a middle-income country like China or India, my theory, the new structural economics, classify the existing industry into 5 categories. The first category is that this industry, you have that, but other high-income countries also have that. And you are on the catching up process. This is catching up industry. And the second one is that you have some industry which are already global leaders. And the third type of industry is that some industry used to have competitive advantage. You are very competitive in the world. But because of increasing wages and so on, you are losing competitive advantage in those sectors. And the fourth type is a new emerging industry that coming from the fourth industrial revolution. And the last one is strategic industry, which is related to your national security or economic securities. And if you divide your industry in these 5 categories, you can always identify what are the bottlenecks for their further development. Then the government can work with the private sectors to help the private sector to remove the bottleneck for their growth. If you do this a very pragmatic way, very pragmatic diagnosis, I think the government will be able to help the private sectors to grow dynamically, especially with a smart minister like Mari like Sri Mulyani and Yifu Pangestu. You know, right? After this, you know how to do it, right?
All right. Thank you, Professor Lin. To Ibu Mari, this is another question to you. I mean, regarding the current US-China rivalry, it would be very, very challenging for businesses here and also as well as in Indonesia and other part of Southeast Asia, because we are always kind of put in the corner to take sides between the US and China. And with the current IRA, Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Acts, that makes us even much more difficult to have kind of this, like having as efficient as possible to engage with businesses in China. How, or what would be your advice to businesses coming here on what would be their strategy in the future?
Yeah, I think the main point is that we should not be drawn either way, because China is important for us. The US market is also continues to be important for us. So how do we navigate between the two? I mean, ideally, the answer should be diversification, so that if certain sectors like critical minerals or EV is perceived as has high level of Chinese dominance, then is it sufficient if you had outward investment from China, which is already happening now? So you have the Chinese production in your country. Is is that sufficient? This is what we continue to worry about, because from the US perspective, they are already looking at how this outward Chinese investment is creating what they call, especially this is mainly for EV and green technologies. They see, oh, this is just lengthening of the supply chain by China and creating hubs in Indonesia, Thailand, Brazil, Morocco, and Hungary, right? And they may start imposing measures, such as what you mentioned, Justin, foreign entity of concern, which at the moment has a definition in the US regulation as ownership of 25% ownership of Chinese ownership, right? So it's not country of origin anymore, it's company of origin. So then it gets really tricky, right? So I think this only happens, I would say, not in all sectors. So in many other sectors, this is not an issue, whether it's the labor-intensive sectors, which are also some of them moving to Indonesia, you know, garments, furniture, shoes. And we should welcome the Chinese investments and work with them to develop not just Indonesia as a OEM, you know, just manufacturing and assembling, but, you know, really get the technology transfer, get the human capital transfer, but it also means governments and policy is important to be able to increase the skill, create the ecosystem, and be open to this investment. For the areas which are sensitive, and this, I think this government is trying to do it for critical minerals, you try to create a larger group than China. Because right now it is dominated by China. As you know, nickel is 70% China. What they want to do now with critical minerals investment downstreaming is to invite Europe, to invite US, to invite Middle East, and to invite any other countries that are interested. Korea, for instance, because they also have the EV, to make it more diversified. But you cannot not have China there, because technology of battery and so on, and EV is still, or even the green technologies for renewable energy, is still, the most efficient is still China, you know. Right. So we are in a bit of a dilemma, right? You want to pick the best and most efficient technology, exactly. But you also need, if you really want to still continue to sell to the US, then you may need to have two separate supply chains. That's what I was alluding to earlier. But it will be at the cost, it will be costly, yeah, right. Yeah.
Thank you, Ibu, for your insight. Coming back to Professor Lin, you know, like if I discuss with Southeast Asians counterparts or East Asians counterparts, there's always this case like China and other developing countries want to learn from the success of Chinese economy. And there's always the case that they raise the importance of state-owned enterprises. But as we know, like, the asset of state-owned enterprises in China and the role of state-owned enterprises in China since 1980s has actually been declining, and China gives more rooms for the private sectors to grow. So what would be your advice for Indonesia and other developing countries to improve the roles of private sectors and to make a clear roles of state-owned enterprises in certain sectors, not tapping those on the private sector?
Well, I do not know enough about Indonesia, so I will not be able to provide advice about how to develop an economy in Indonesia. But I know enough about China and related to the issue of state-owned enterprises. In 1978, when China started transition from a planned economy to a market economy, at that time, almost 100% of the firms are owned by the state. Currently, it reduced down to about 25%. So the private sector certainly is very important. But state-owned sector is still very important. Because in the 1980s, 1990s, the idea was that state-owned sectors were not efficient. You should privatize all of them. And for Soviet Union, Eastern European country, many Latin American country, and African country followed the policy advice, privatized all their state-owned sectors. But the consequence was the collapse of their economy and a frequent crisis of their economy. China did not do that. In 1978 transition, China did not privatize any state-owned sectors. They are maintained state-owned. But at the same time, China liberalized the entry of the private sector to the new industries. Because at that time, most of the state-owned enterprises are in capital-intensive heavy industries, and they were inconsistent with China's competitive advantages. And if the Chinese government did not provide support to them, they will either go bankrupt or even if you privatize them, you will have to continue to subsidize them. And Chinese government did not privatize them to maintain stability and also own them directly by state. It's easier to discipline them to, turn them into private. Because what you see in Eastern European countries, for large state-owned enterprises in telecommunication, in power sectors, they all become oligarch and become so powerful, and they control the state instead of state control them. So in that regard, in the transition process, it's very important to maintain stability by continuing to own that sector by the government. But with the liberalization or entry to the new sector, which are labor intensive, they grow so dynamically. As a result, capital accumulation in China has been very fast. Gradually, those state-owned sectors in the past, they went against China's competitive advantages. Most of them now become consistent with China's competitive advantages. And the protection and subsidies to them will be unnecessary. And so the government remove many distortion, many control. But currently, the state-owned sector still contribute to the Chinese growth in 3 areas. One, related to the basic needs of the people. Second one, related to the natural monopoly in the economy. Third one, in some strategic sectors. For those kind of basic needs, for example, provision of food, you need to have food security. And so it's very important for the state to own the sectors. Especially China need to import a grain from abroad. If it's too diversified, China will lose the bargaining power. So it's owned by the state. And China maintain enough reserve, so China in a very good bargaining position to maintain food security. And for some sector like natural monopoly, power, telecommunication, if you look into other countries' experiences, after privatization, they became oligarch and charge very high prices. And China maintain them stay owned, so they can China will be easier to regulate them and to discipline them. And the third one is some strategic sector, because the great power rivalry with the US and certain kind of technology which are not our competitive advantages. It would be better to import, but the US may not be willing to share those kind of technology to us. Then we need to develop those kind of technology by ourselves. Since they went against the competitive advantages, they are not profitable. Unless the government support them, they will not be there. So the state-owned sector now are mainly in those 3 areas. Other than that, now, it's fully competitive by the private sectors. Even the state sectors still be there. They have to compete with the private sectors.
Thank you, Professor Lin. Now let's take one first round of 2 questions from the audience. Please mention your name and institutions and your questions directly to one of the panelists here. Oh, we have already heard from. So apparently you need to get into the QR code that the committee has provided you. Now this is a question from Muhammad Akbar Hidayat. As reported in various media that there are many threats to the economy, such as environmental threats and wars, what will be the best strategy to address these threats to help the economy grow by 8%? So this is questions addressed to Professor Lin. What would be the best strategy? I think like challenges.
It says additionally what kind?
Yeah, what kind of investments should people make to increase? So yeah, basically regarding the current challenges on the current geopolitical tensions and now even the hot tensions, what would be China's strategy to maintain or to achieve this kind of optimal growth that China try to target?
Okay, these are very good questions. Regarding the environmental threat, the climate change and so on, China turns out into an opportunity. Because if you want to cope with the climate change, environmental issue, you need to green the economy. And if you want to green the economy, you need to have the technology. And the Chinese government promote the technological innovation in the green industry. So now China is the major provider of solar panels. It's green technology. China now is the most competitive producer of electronic cars. So for the environmental issue, it's a threat. But we cannot avoid that. Since we cannot avoid that, we should turn that from a threat into an opportunity for development. That's the first one. Regarding the world, it's very bad. We should have peace. And so the reason why we have war, because we have some conflicts. And the best way to address the conflicts is through diplomatic negotiation in the table instead of war. And that's a Chinese philosophy. So China is a champion of the global peace. China take a lot of initiative through diplomatic effort, try to bring down the world, and China try to avoid the world. And it's good for China, and should be also good for the world.
Thank you, Professor Lin. The committee, can you please give a microphone to the gentleman here at the front? He wants to raise questions. Please.
Yeah, hello. My name is Felix. I'm from Kawanasi. I really enjoyed the session from the morning until today. I'm trying to connect the dots that today we heard from Pak Jokowi about Indonesia should decide its own economic characteristic. And we also talk about the optimistic. We heard about the need for Indonesian-centric. We heard about the gizi, nutritious food, health, etc. From Ibu Mari, we also heard about being sustainable, green, hilirisasi, carbon credit, food and land use, diversification. And we know about Indonesian fertile soil. We know about the forest potential and also the sea potential. And we also know about the high domestic consumptions that we have in Indonesia. And Indonesia as a relative stable country. My question to Ibu Mari, in your view, do you think a sustainable food and land use for agriculture and carbon could be a great next hilirisasi sector? Because Ibu tadi mentioned about diversification. Maybe can this sustainable food and land use can be a good next hilirisasi sector selain tambang ya, as a drive for economic transformation? If yes, we really appreciate your view on what are the best practice for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Please, Ibu.
Thank you for your question. I totally agree with you. I think sustainable agriculture and land use that goes with it is going to be a key sector for Indonesia for a couple of reasons. The first reason is in light of our green growth, should be in light of our green growth agenda. food and land use is actually, at the moment, still #1 source of CO2 emission, right? Energy is close second, but food and land use is still #1. And it has a lot to do with the use of fertilizer and the methane that comes out from it, and the fact that we are still, we have done well on the deforestation, reducing deforestation, but there is still the land issue, the use of the land issue. And this is, so second thing I would say is that we need a comprehensive strategy, and we must make sure that the program of the government of food estates is not going to actually lead to increased clearing of land in an unsustainable way, right? This is something that people are worried about. So we are all for increasing food production, but how do we do it? Maybe it shouldn't just be food estate. We should really look at improving the land use and the sustainable agriculture practices, as well as one important issue. This has become a very big issue. When I was at the World Bank, we did a lot of work on this, the fertilizer subsidy. You could actually, this is a big discussion right now, you could actually repurpose your fertilizer subsidy to have better, well-targeted subsidy for sustainable agriculture, which actually will improve your farmers' well-being. And this, if we could actually do that, that would be also A, good for the fiscal situation, and B, actually will help the farmers, as well as help the, I would say, the nutritious food, free nutritious food for schools program. And my final point is that you can actually do sustainable agriculture, and we have many models. I'm for a sustainable green rice production, low carbon rice production, and there are examples of doing that, where what you do is you use less water, less fertilizer, less pesticide, and use organic fertilizer, and do a full circular economy where the waste becomes also part of the compost, and also et cetera, et cetera. So it's doable, but you will need a more comprehensive approach in government. But I would say it's positive on all fronts: green, livelihood of farmers, food supply, because we are always talking about food sovereignty and food self-sufficiency.
Thank you, Ibu. Apparently, we received hundreds of questions from the audience. So I would like very much to invite you to have a direct discussion during lunchtime. And before we end the sessions, I would like to invite each speaker to provide the final remark. Please. 1 minute.
Well, as I said, the most important thing is looking into the opportunity of the country. And to work together to make that opportunity turn into reality. And for that, I think Indonesia has a lot of opportunities. And I'm sure with your determination, the Golden Indonesia 2045 will be a reality instead of a dream.
Yes. Thank you.
I think we are going to see increased uncertainties, but it's also opportunities, as we have been all talking about. And you are going to see a different world, just accept that the world is different. The way you are going to operate and work is going to be different. So companies and countries need to be agile, need to be green, and need to embrace the transformation that comes with technology. And for that, you really need, I would say, a really comprehensive and multi-sector approach to make it happen. Because at the end of the day, how do you implement this given the uncertainties out there? You all need to talk to each other and listen to each other more.
And before we end, I just would like to remind you that this is talking about opportunities. This is one of the opportunities for all of you to get engaged one to another. And please stay until today and tomorrow, because we're going to have a lot of interesting sessions on circular economy, investments, regional investments, trade, and ASEAN's economic outlook. So please stay with us until tomorrow, and there will be many interesting issues and opportunities for all of you. Once again, please join me to give a big round of applause for our speakers today. Thank you, Ibu.
Terima kasih untuk Ibu Lili Yan Ing sebagai moderator pada hari ini, and amazing speakers and panelists. Ibu Mr. Justin Yifu Lin dan Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu. Boleh beri tepuk tangan sekali lagi yang meriah untuk panelis kita yang luar biasa hari ini. Hadirin tamu undangan, mohon izin kami mengundang moderator dan juga para panelis untuk dapat berdiri. Berikutnya penyerahan cindera mata. Kami mengundang Ibu Aprevita Wulansari selaku Managing Director dari BNI Universe. Kami undang semua panelis dan Ibu Vita serta moderator berfoto bersama terlebih dahulu. Sekali lagi kami ucapkan terima kasih atas partisipasinya dalam BNI Investor Daily Summit 2024 untuk berbagi, berdiskusi, memberikan banyak gambaran serta insight untuk topik yang kita bahas pada hari ini. Kepada moderator, panelis, dan Ibu Aprevita Wulansari, kami persilahkan untuk dapat kembali ke tempat duduk. Hadirin tamu undangan yang berbahagia, dan pada kesempatan ini kami mengucapkan terima kasih banyak untuk seluruh pihak yang telah mendukung terselenggaranya BNI Investor Daily Summit 2024 ini. Terima kasih kepada BNI, Astra, Chandra Asri Group, PT Pupuk Indonesia Persero, Peluang, PIK 2, Petrindo Jaya Kreasi, Petrosi, April, Vale Indonesia, Amazon Web Services VB Cloud, Telkom Indonesia, Bukit Asam, Inalum, PT Sri Rejeki Isman Tbk atau Sritex, Intibios, City Vision, Pixel, dan Chandra Karya.